Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on US Catholicism in the 20th century, moving into a presidential election year, 1928, where a Catholic had the temerity to run for the position, which introduces us to Alfred Emanuel Smith, four-term governor of New York, received the Democratic nomination for president in 1928. He was known as a progressive social reformer, capitalized progressive in the specific sense that we've been discussing. You know, one who believed that it was the proper function of government to involve itself in and manage, deal with social economic problems for to achieve the greater good. His Catholic faith had not presented a problem in New York politics, because New York, especially the city, New York City, had a substantial Catholic population because it was a port, and so many immigrants came. Those, and many were Catholic, from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Hungary. Once he became a national candidate, however, for president, a wave of anti-Catholicism erupted that was at times violent and always widespread. So the short version of this is that he lost the election, the 1928 election, to Herbert Hoover. It is said that it is widely believed that the reason a later Catholic who ran for president, and in his case won, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, senator from Massachusetts, that the reason he gave his famous speech during the campaign of 1960 to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association at the Rice Hotel, in which he emphasized that he was not the Catholic candidate for president, but rather he was the Democratic nominee who happened to be Catholic, was because the reason he did that was because of the memory, the living memory of this, what happened to Al Smith. All right, Alfred Emanuel Smith was born on December 30th, 1873. He was, as he rose in local politics in New York, he joined the efficiency movement, which was it was part of the progressive movement, but it was promoting efficiency and responsibility among urban governments, municipal governments, that they should be more efficient in order to serve the common good. First to expand their functions, to involve themselves involve the government more in local affairs in order to manage things and, theoretically improve things. He was noted when he finally got an executive position as governor, four-term governor of New York. He was noted for doing it, not just preaching it, but he was known for a wide range of reforms as governor in the 1920s. He was the son of an Irish-American mother. His father was a veteran of the Civil War, fought for the North. He was Al himself was born and was brought up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, near the Brooklyn Bridge, where he resided for essentially his entire life. Along with many other New York politicians of the era, necessity required affiliation with the Tammany Hall political machine in order to achieve position in local politics. The Tammany Hall political machine controlled New York City politics. Smith was a strong opponent of prohibition. So as we see, humans being humans, that even among the progressives, everyone did not agree on everything. So prohibition was a progressive cause. They figure, okay, it's the government's place to regulate personal morality. But Smith, was, even though he was a progressive, in this he differed from his progressive, cousins, in that he viewed prohibition as an unconstitutional government authoritarianism. Many Protestants feared his candidacy, including German Lutherans and Southern Baptists, believing, as we covered way back, in the 1840s, that round of anti-Catholicism, the conspiracy, that the Pope in Rome would dictate the policy of the U.S. government if a Catholic were in the White House. The incumbent Republican Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, was greatly aided in his run against Al Smith by the national prosperity of the time, as the 1920s were a boom time. I mean, we think of the Depression, but that happened in 1929. For the earlier part of the decade, the 20s were a boom time. And also it was a time of peace. The U.S. was not involved in any war. So Smith lost in a landslide. He lost 6 southern states alone. 4 years later, Smith sought the 1932. He ran for president again. He sought the nomination for the Democratic Party in 1932. That time he ran against FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, defeated by him. And they both were New York, and actually both had held the same position. FDR had also been governor of New York. So after this second defeat, he didn't try again. Smith entered business in New York City, became involved in construction, and he was one of the promoters. He was on the board to build the Empire State Building, the top of the world, largest building in the world at that point. And as time passed, he became an increasingly vocal opponent of Roosevelt's New Deal. That's an interesting twist because the New Deal flows entirely 100% out of the progressive political ideology, and Smith, as part of the efficiency movement, the good government, he was a progressive. But just as he differed with him on prohibition, he thought Roosevelt had gone too far. That especially the second New Deal, which we'll cover the differences as we go along in future videos. But he thought that it had gone too far. That the New Deals, especially the second New Deal, had taken an emergency situation, the Depression, which Smith acknowledged required an emergency response from the government, but instead was taking that a step farther and institutionalizing permanently, the government interference, and that's why he opposed it. Okay. One example of the anti-Catholicism that Smith's presidential candidacy triggered or set off was a march by the Klan in August of 1925. Thousands of robed and hooded Klansmen marched in the nation's capital to display their numbers, which, in terms of votes, that means power, and their opposition, not only to Catholicism, but also to immigration. As in this period in the 20s, the anti-immigrants were one with anti-Catholics because so many of the immigrants happened to be Catholic, from Ireland, from Poland, from Hungary, from Italy, southern Germany. Okay. Cross burnings occurred across the country in protest against his nomination. Anyway, okay. So he lost. He lost to, and so the 31st president was Herbert Clark Hoover, born August 10th, 1874. In terms of religion, he was Quaker. In terms of politics, he was a Republican. In terms of profession, by background, he was an engineer. As Quakers customarily do not swear oaths, it was expected that Hoover would affirm the oath of office, and most sources state that he did so rather than swear, affirm rather than swear. However, a Washington Post article dated February 7th, 1929, stated that he planned to swear. When he was sworn in, that instead of just affirm on March 4th, 1929. In any case, it turned out to be fortuitous for Al Smith that he did not win, so Hoover was sworn in on March 4th, 1929. Later the same year, the Depression began. Okay, the 1920s had been a time of economic prosperity for the United States. which meant there was a great deal of disposable income. It was widely believed that the stock market was a place where a person's life savings could be multiplied without actually working. Let the money make money. And this was responsible, this idea, this lure, was responsible for the development of what turned out to be an irresponsible business practice called margin buying, which was a person would buy a stock in a publicly traded company by paying only 10 to 20% of the actual cost and enter into a debt arrangement with a bank or other lender for the balance. One risk of this procedure was that the lender could make a margin call, meaning they would demand that the investor repay the full debt. So to use a simplistic example, say it cost $100 to buy stock in Consolidated Edison, Con Ed. But I don't want to, this allows me, I can just give $10 and get that, get the stock and enter into a debt arrangement with some bank, First Bank of whatever, Wall Street, for the rest. So this means that for the same $100, I could put down money and get 10 stocks instead of just buying one for $100. So I'm in debt for the balance to what could be multiple institutions. And every one of those, whether it's one or all of them, have the right as part of the loan, and that's all signed, that's in writing, I've agreed to that. They could demand the whole amount from me at once. Now, if it is just that one transaction, well, okay, that wouldn't be that big of a risk. But, but the lure of this made it, lured people, tricked people, duped people, or rather they duped themselves, into doing this more times than they could actually afford, meaning that they had incurred debts to buy more stock than they could actually afford and had committed themselves to debt arrangements beyond what they could actually pay if those lenders exercised their rights under the terms of the contract to demand all the money at once. Okay. So this practice, margin buying, enabled an exponential increase in the number of stock market investors. As with this practice, people who normally never thought about investing in the stock market because they just didn't have disposable income that they could just put somewhere and just leave it for years. But now they could. In September of 1929, I know you think in October, but nothing just happens. October 29 did not just happen. So earlier in the 20s, this margin buying practice developed. So by September of 1929, an event occurred that, in retrospect, set in motion the sequence of events that culminated in the stock market crash, which introduces us to Boston Edison Company, BEC. It was a lucrative power company, and it had reached the limit of stock that it could issue, which means that, okay, it had gotten all the investors it could under the current, it was authorized to issue a certain amount of stock. It sold all that stock. But it wanted more money. So how do we get more investors? Well, we don't have that much. There's only so many pages in this book, and if each page is a stock, well, okay, once it's gone, then it's gone. So, what they did, instead of expanding the company, which would mean there's more company to invest in, so that would give them a legitimate right to issue more stock, they requested permission from the Massachusetts Public Service Commission to embark on another, what turns out to be unsound business practice, issuing split shares and sell the now partial shares separately, in effect pretending that they had more shares than they could actually fund. So if each page of this book is a share, now, okay, I reached the limit. Say this is, whatever, 400 pages, 400 shares. Well, they petitioned and they got permission from the Massachusetts Public Service Commission. So instead, say I'm going to tear this page. I'm going to tear this page in 5. So even though this is 1 share, I can sell it 5 times because I'm splitting the shares. And I'm selling it to people who maybe they can't afford it, but they can buy it on margin. So they only have to give me 10% of its worth. So on paper, my number of investors, and at least my official, even though I don't have the money because they're doing it on debt, then officially on paper, my books as Boston Edison is growing. See that? Yeah. Okay. Nothing just happens. All right. Permission for this was refused. As a result, the value of the existing stock rose, enabling holders, people who already had each page as a stock, so now it's finite, so that now the value is rising. So it enables them to sell it in turn, to sell their stock in turn at far higher prices than they paid, and at far higher prices than had any basis in the actual value. Boston Edison was a valuable company, but no value was infinite. So now it's artificially inflated. This is creating a bubble. As a result, the value of the existing stock, say each page, the value of that rose so much that it caused a cycle of frantic selling and buying, irrationally inflating Edison stock and escalating prices. So the members of the board of Boston Edison, who had some of the stock themselves, well, they saw a chance that they could enhance their personal fortune, as well as enhance, the company's holdings. But it's all on paper. So that it artificially increases the value of because now they can sell each page for far more than it's actually worth. So the 400 pages of the stock, this reflects what the company's actually worth. The buildings, the personnel, how much power it produces, how many customers, that reflects a real value. But now, because of this, and because of the margin calls, or that possibility of the margin call, this becomes far more valuable. So a stock, they can always cash in a stock on a company. So if they go to the company and they want to cash in the value of the stock is artificially inflated beyond what the company is worth and beyond the money that it can actually pay to redeem that stock. So they keep doing it, just wanting to make as much as they can before it all crashes. So this is a bubble. All right. And people want to get in on it because they know intuitively it's not going to last forever. So those who are selling, they want to make as much as they can. So that those who own the stock, they put as much on the market as they can and sell and sell and sell. And then the people who bought it, since the price keeps going up, if they bought it, say it was cost $100 for one share, well, it's artificially inflated, so they paid $500, knowing that because it's in an ascending cycle, that if it goes up, it will go up. Then a week later, they spent $500 on it. They can sell it for $1,000. All right. In order to meet the extravagant price to buy this coveted stock, a group of investors formed an investment pool of their own stocks, which bought and sold under the name of a new investment group. This would be like a hedge fund today. International Combustion Engineering, ICE. They use stock in their own companies, other companies, not just Boston Edison, as collateral to buy stocks in Boston Edison Power. In order to get as many stocks as they could, they bought on margin. So it's an inflated value. They're taking out a loan, using their own businesses as collateral to buy stock in a company that is artificially inflated. And they're only getting they're only paying for a portion of the stock so they can maximize how much they have. And their gamble is that a week later they can sell it for 30% more, 40% more, but it doesn't stop there. If a week later they do make 40% more, well, let's do it again. And then if a week after that they make 45% more, well, they're not just going to keep the money and put it in the bank. Let's do it again and again. And every one of those cycles goes up more and more artificial. It's there. Okay. So with that background, so it's just waiting to, something's going to happen. Which brings us to October 24th, 1929. That investment group, the hedge fund, ICE, International Combustion Engineering, failed to meet a promised dividend payment to its own investors. So this hedge fund had investors. So this hedge fund was playing this game, and they had people investing in them who were trusting them to do the investing for them. Well, you invest to get dividends, and so because they had kept taking out loans, and they were buying on margin, and they were only paying 10% of what the stock is worth, they don't own the complete stock because they haven't paid for it all yet. So they ran out of money to pay the dividends to their investors in the hedge fund. So those investors in the hedge fund began selling their stock in ICE, which lowered the value of that stock. ICE then, in an effort to halt the panic, which, since this is all a fantasy, I mean, it's all based on perceived value, that, and that's all they have. So they have to stop that as soon as they can. So they decided to sell their stocks in Boston Edison so that they could meet the dividend payments and restore investor confidence before it became a full panic. So for the next 5 days, October 24th plus 5 days, the following process unfolded. Element 1. ICE, International Combustion Engineering, the hedge fund, suddenly placed a large amount of Boston Edison Power stock on the market. Supply and demand. So now the supply is increased, which means the price goes down. Because scarcity, it was all based on scarcity that it artificially inflated. Well, now it's no longer scarce. As ICE they need to liquidate to make money, and everybody knows it. At least everybody on the inside, the kind of people who were doing this, they all know that. They know that ICE is on the hook, that they have to meet a dividend payment. So they have to, everybody knows they have to take less, so they can bargain down. So ICE value stock goes down. Boston Power did not want their stock value to fall in this way. So it's their stock, but ICE had invested in it. But Boston Power is looking at this, and they say, okay, the ICE is dumping all the stock on the market, which is lowering the value of the perceived value of our company. They didn't want that to happen. So they started buying up their own stock, but stock that was owned by ICE, in order to artificially recreate the scarcity. So investors would pay scarcity prices. The bankers, so element 2, the bankers and the lenders, who had loaned people money to do the margin buying, became nervous at this process. So they're afraid, one slip of timing, and it's all going to collapse, and they're not going to get the money back that they loaned to people for the stock purchases in the first place. So the bankers and the lenders and all this exercised their right under the margin buying agreement, and they issued a margin call demanding that both Boston Power and the hedge fund ICE repay the money they all borrowed to buy the stocks in the first place on margin. Needless to say, neither side of the equation had that much cash on hand. Even if they wanted to pay it all, I mean, they didn't want to be dishonest, but it just wasn't there because everything was artificially inflated. So when word leaked that these two giants, Boston Edison and the ICE hedge fund investment group, could not meet their financial obligations to banks, panic. Everybody who owned stocks in both sold it immediately. So, okay, I'll take a little loss, but I'll get something back, fearing that if they don't do that, then it's going to be zero and they'll lose everything. So that's the run. That's the panic. As a result, the next element. As a result, the same process was replicated in other sectors of the market. People who had bought this stock are now exposed, so they need cash on hand. So they're selling the stock that they have in companies that are not involved in this at all. Not because anything is wrong with those other companies, but because the investors need the money to cover their obligations because of the margin buying. Because if they fail to meet it with the banks, then they can't do business anymore. So that's how it spreads, all through the market. Companies that were not involved in this at all are now compromised because of all because of this margin buying and the split. The stock dumping meant loss of value of those stocks. Loss of value meant possible default on margin loans. To get their money back, banks issued margin calls on stocks and companies which weren't involved in this at all, which investors were not able to pay because all the investors in the decade of the 20s had fallen into the trap, or I don't want to say it. It wasn't. It was a business instrument. It just got out of hand. Causing the perceived value of the companies in which they had stock was falling, not because anything happened to the company, not because a factory burned down and they can't make their widgets anymore, but just because the value of the stock had been artificially inflated in the first place. And the banks that had loaned this money for margin buying, when all these people started defaulting, lost the wealth they had been carrying on their books as money owed to them, therefore as their assets that they didn't really have. And once the run happened and businesses started failing, the pretense could no longer be sustained. And that is what culminated in the stock market crash on October 29th, 1929. The connection between the stock market crash and the Great Depression was the banks. The involvement of banks in unsecured stock speculation and unsecured margin loans meant that the banks were not able to meet their obligations to depositors, who may have had nothing at all to do with the stock market. They might have depositors who didn't invest in the market. They just put their cash there because, if they kept it under the bed and there was a fire, then they'd lose everything. So they'll go put it in the bank. It'll be safe. But now that the banks had loaned out this money, considering that as investments and as assets, but now it's all crashed, so that's off their books. And when news leaked, the news did not include this whole complicated story. All that the average person heard is that the banks are losing money. Naturally, the depositor wanted to get his or her money out before the bank ran out of money. The banks did not have all that money in their vaults. So they were not able, even if they wanted to, they were not able to give depositors the money they had originally deposited in the bank. Because of this cycle, 9,000 banks in the United States alone failed. That is how the collapse of the fantasy economy of the stock market of the 1920s wrecked the actual economy of production and sale. How? It happened thusly. Businesses, even if they don't invest in any stock at all, just a business, businesses have to routinely borrow money to buy supplies and goods for their monthly operation. And they borrow that from banks. And that's just part of a regular, and so, at the end of the month, they made profit on that, so they borrow money to buy whatever. Then they put that on the shelf with a markup, so they make a profit, they sell it, and then that profit, that enables them to pay off the bank, make a little profit, buy some more product to sell, and that's just, that's business. That's the American way. Well, what happens when the bank they do business with collapsed? Not because of anything they did, the business, but because of all this stock market. So those businesses then, they don't have a bank to go to. So they can't borrow money to buy milk to put on the shelf for people to buy. So the grocery folks, so their business, say it's a grocery, so that the grocery collapses. Further, another connection is even businesses as well as private, if they put money in the bank just to store it because it's in a vault, just to keep it safe, well, that's gone. That's gone. Now, suppose a person who doesn't own a business but works at a business, a person who works in the business that needs to borrow money from the bank every month to buy a product to sell, and then with the profits pays the employee. Well, the employee is one of those people who stored money in the bank, and that's gone too. The business can't exist anymore, so that person's out of a job. And that person can't go to the bank to get their money, their cushion, their safety net, because the bank is closed. And the bank doesn't have the money. The bank had loaned it out. So money is disappearing from the economy. This is a deflationary economic crisis. Money's disappearing. 25% of the workers in the country were unemployed within a month. And if one removed agricultural workers from the equation, it was 37% unemployment rate. Even worse was the psychological impact. No one really understood why this happened. No one knew how to fix it. No matter how many times I teach this, I still find myself getting all the details, all the dates, and all that's tracked down. That's all this, but even it's like, and when it hit the press, all these details weren't in there. It's just look at what happened. Especially coming at the end of the 1920s, which were a boom time. It was peacetime and boom time. No one knew what to do. No one knew how to fix it. So the result was that the populations of the world became increasingly desperate and therefore dependent on their governments for survival. In the U.S., this meant acceptance of the New Deal, even by people who feared that the New Deal would institutionalize socialism in the country. They figured, well, okay, if it's that or hunger, well, all right, then, we'll just accept it. So to put some more numbers to it, in terms of world production, between 1929 and 1932, only 3 years, copper, an essential commodity, fell from 1.9 million tons to 900,000 tons in terms of global production, because there wasn't the demand, because people did, well, there might have been demand in the sense people wanted it, but they couldn't pay for it. Iron fell from 98.5 million tons to 39.7. Same reason. There may have been demand. People might want to buy it, but they don't have the money. Steel production fell from 120 million tons to 50 million tons. Coal production fell from 1.3 billion tons to 948 million. The population of the U.S. became so desperate, a desperation that made them receptive to progressive ideas of government-managed social improvement. So, in a state like this, in this mental state, the country elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president number 32 in 1932 because of his promise of a New Deal for the nation. That's capitalized. That was his political platform, a New Deal. This New Deal would be constructed by the government, and it would take on an interventionist role in the economy in order to prevent the social collapse and civil anarchy, which was imminent if a large part of the population were left to starve. In desperation, some people might just curl up in the corner and just die, just wait to die. But other people are not. Other people are going to go down fighting, and that's what would destroy the country. Now, Roosevelt was not a Catholic, yet it is striking how many proposals from the Bishop's Plan of 1919 were codified by the legislation in the New Deal period, which we will cover in due course. Let me see where we are now. Okay. We will stop here, and then I'll start the next video. We'll cover the first New Deal. So then it'll be all together. Okay. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.